Those stories, and there are more. With us now is retired General Colin Powell, who served as President Bush's chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff during the first Gulf War. He was also President Reagan's national security advisor and Secretary of State under President George H.W. Bush. General, so good to have you here this morning. That story, too, really, what about the president's personal diplomacy? It helped him and this country immensely.
But the story you just told is a familiar one because I knew the interpreter. And I can tell you he was terrified. He was always terrified. Putin, nah, no problem. And Gorbachev was also an interesting person to see with President Bush and then with President Reagan. And I was also national security advisor to Bush and to Reagan, of course, in the last 2 years of the administration. And it was a fascinating period as the changeover was taking place between President Reagan and now President Bush.
And what was happening there with the Soviet Union was it was disintegrating. And talk a little bit about President Bush's restraint in dealing with that, because Democrats were saying, go take a victory lap.
No, he wouldn't do it. He would never do any such thing. His mother would come down on him. But that was the way he was almost on everything. After the Gulf War, American people were absolutely overjoyed with what they saw their soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines doing. And New York wanted to have this massive ticker tape parade, which they put together, going up Broadway, just like the old days. And Bush said, I'm not going to go. Mr. President, why not? This belongs to the troops, not to me. That's the way it was.
And how did that humility define his presidency?
It was always there. He was tough. Let no one think that he was soft in humility. But he always cared for the other person. He always tried to look out for the needs and the wants of the other person. And so when the Cold War ended and the Soviet Union was falling apart, he was more interested in what they needed to become a functioning society and a democratic system than anything else. Another example of tomorrow, there will be a group of soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines who are coming here who were veterans of the invasion of Panama and Desert Storm. He specifically asked that we assemble this group of troops so that they could pay tribute to him, but that isn't what he really wanted. He wanted to pay tribute to them.
Well, General, I think about, too, I mean, he was the last president to have served in combat, shot down during World War II, lost his two crewmates. He knows loss. He knows loss. And when we ended the Gulf War, it's rather surprisingly to the public, he did that because he said, is there any reason to kill more Americans or to kill more Iraqis? And he wanted to bring the war to an end. The war was defined in time and space. We're going to kick the Iraqis out of Kuwait. We are going to restore the government of Kuwait and make sure that Iraq doesn't have the capability to do that again. All that was accomplished. And this nonsensical comment about, well, why didn't he go to Baghdad? That's nice to say that now. But he and the United Nations and the world had a mission, and that was to deal with the Iraqis in Kuwait and not to go take over the country of Iraq. He hoped that Saddam Hussein would fall. Didn't happen, but
he once told Gorbachev that he was cautious but not timid, which I think
that's exactly right.
People talked about his lack of the vision thing, but on foreign policy, he did have a vision, right?
This is nonsense. This was a man with vision. He just didn't, broadcast it, but he knew what he was doing. He was with Reagan for those years when the Soviet Union was starting to come apart, when Gorbachev came on the scene. And he followed that very, very closely. And so he was ready to take over from Reagan. And he knew what he was dealing with in Gorbachev. But he was cautious. He was cautious, and in the first few months of his administration, he was a little reluctant to move out too quickly to work with the Russians. But then when he realized what he had and what they were needing, he jumped right in, and he immediately went, you recall, that summit meeting they had on a ship in the storm. Bush loved
shaky stomach.
But that's just that's the way he was. He was cautious. And whenever we had to meet on something, whether it was Panama or Desert Storm or Desert Shield, you would sit with him in the Oval Office, the Gang of Eight we called ourselves. And we all knew each other from other positions. So we were buddies, but we knew how to fight and argue with each other. And we would do that in front of the president. And he would just listen, sort of chewing his lip and asking a few questions. But he was very, very cautious, and he would take it all in, and he would not make some jump decision out of nowhere. He would think it through. and then decide what was best for the country. But not only what was best for the country, what was best for the world. Yeah. He saw the world, not just the country. America first. America's always been first in my heart, but to make America first, you have to be part of a broader world, and that's what he understood.
Well, General, thank you so much for talking about his legacy, and I think the values that many people are mourning as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
We will cover a series of events over the next 4 days as the country says goodbye to President Bush. The former president will be taken from Houston to Washington later this morning, and CBS News will bring you that ceremony in a special report. We'll have other special reports this afternoon. After Mr. Bush arrives at Joint Base Andrews, he will lie in state in the Capitol Rotunda until Wednesday morning, and there will be a funeral service at the National Cathedral in Washington on Wednesday before Mr. Bush's casket is returned home to Texas. After a private funeral, he will be buried on Thursday next to his wife and his daughter Robin at his presidential library at Texas A&M University.